In March of 1864, when the 28th Massachusetts Infantry marched through the backwaters of St. Landry Parish in Louisiana, they expected to find abandoned plantations and scattered resistance. What they found instead at Bellerose Estate would make veteran soldiers physically ill and force the Army to classify their discovery as confidential for over 80 years. Behind a locked iron door in the cellar of the main house, 1 teen children huddled together in darkness, some as young as 3, others approaching adolescence. All of them bore the same distinctive features: pale green eyes, auburn hair streaked with gold, and high, prominent cheekbones. The eldest, a girl of 14, told the officers something that haunted them for the rest of their lives. "Mistress says we are her legacy. We cannot leave because we are her blood. Tonight, we reveal the systematic horror that Madame Celeste Bellerose created over 13 years, and why the Army chose silence over truth." Before we continue with what those soldiers found in that Louisiana cellar, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button right now, because stories like this, stories they deliberately buried in classified military reports, need to be told. And tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your state or city in the comments. Let's see how far the truth can travel. St. Landry Parish in 1851 was a place where French Creole culture met the brutal reality of cotton slavery. The parish sat in the fertile lowlands of central Louisiana, close enough to New Orleans to participate in its commerce, remote enough to maintain secrets that would never reach the city. Bellerose Estate was not among the largest plantations in the parish. It comprised only 400 acres and employed 22 enslaved people. But what made it unusual was its owner. Celeste Bellerose was a widow at 32 when our story begins in 1851. She had inherited the plantation from her husband Antoine, who died of cholera in 1849, leaving her with 3 sons and a property teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. In a society where women rarely managed plantations independently, Celeste was an anomaly. She was educated, having attended a convent school in New Orleans. She spoke French, English, and enough Spanish to conduct business with Mexican traders. She kept meticulous account books and ran Bellerose with an efficiency that surprised the male planters who had expected her to fail. Her 3 sons were the center of her world. Lucien, the eldest at 15 in 1851, was tall and serious, with his father's dark hair, but his mother's piercing green eyes. Remy, 13, was more volatile, quicker to anger but also more charming when he chose to be. And Claude, the youngest at 11, was quiet and bookish, spending hours in the small plantation library his grandfather had assembled. The Bellerose family had been in Louisiana since before the Louisiana Purchase. They were considered old Creole aristocracy, though their fortune had declined significantly by 1850. Antoine's death had accelerated this decline. He had been a poor manager, prone to gambling and expensive tastes. When he died, he left Celeste with debts totaling nearly $8,000, an enormous sum at the time. Celeste spent the first year of her widowhood in a desperate attempt to save the plantation. She sold off furniture, jewelry, anything of value. She personally supervised the fields, learning the brutal mathematics of cotton production. She discovered that running a plantation profitably required more enslaved workers than she could afford to purchase. The price of slaves had been rising steadily throughout the 1840s, and by 1850, a healthy adult male could cost $1,500 or more. It was during one of her trips to New Orleans in the spring of 1851 that Celeste encountered an idea that would reshape her understanding of what was possible. She was visiting a cousin, Marguerite Dubois, who managed her own small plantation in Jefferson Parish. During dinner conversation, Marguerite mentioned that some planters were experimenting with breeding programs to increase their enslaved populations without the expense of purchasing new workers. Celeste was not shocked by this. Breeding had been part of slavery for generations. What shocked her was Marguerite's description of the systematic approach some planters were taking. They were keeping detailed records, tracking bloodlines, and making strategic decisions about pairings to maximize the value of offspring. They treated their enslaved people like livestock, applying the same principles horse breeders used to improve their stock. That night, alone in her room at Marguerite's house, Celeste began making calculations in a small leather journal. If she could increase her enslaved population through breeding rather than purchasing, she could save thousands of dollars. More importantly, children born on the plantation would be completely under her control from birth. They would know no other life, no other master. They would be, in a sense, the perfect workers. But as Celeste worked through the mathematics, she encountered a problem. Her enslaved population was too small to sustain a meaningful breeding program. She had only 7 women of childbearing age, and several of them were already in their 30s or 40s. To generate enough children to make a difference, she would need more women. But purchasing women was exactly what she couldn't afford to do. It was then that a thought entered Celeste's mind. A thought so transgressive, so fundamentally wrong, that she initially dismissed it. But it returned, again and again, insistent. She had 3 sons. Young, healthy sons who would reach reproductive age within a few years. What if she could use them as part of her breeding program? Not with her existing enslaved women. That would be too obvious, too scandalous if discovered. But what if there was another way? Over the following weeks, Celeste began researching legal precedents regarding the children of enslaved people. What she discovered both shocked and intrigued her. Under Louisiana law, as in most slave states, the condition of the child followed the condition of the mother. If the mother was enslaved, the child was enslaved regardless of who the father was. This principle, partus sequitur ventrum, was the legal foundation of the entire system. But Celeste also discovered a more obscure legal principle. If a free woman had a child, and that child was registered as being born to an enslaved woman, the registration took legal precedence over biological reality. The child would be considered enslaved property. It was this loophole that gave Celeste her monstrous idea. What if she could convince or force free women to bear children who would then be registered as the offspring of enslaved women? The children would be legally sellable property, and no one would question the documentation as long as it appeared properly filed. The problem was finding free women desperate or foolish enough to participate in such a scheme. And then Celeste realized she already had access to the perfect subjects. Her own daughters. No, not daughters. Celeste had only born sons, but that could be changed. Not biologically, but legally, socially, through a process of gradual conditioning and manipulation that would transform free children into breeding stock for her plantation economy. Wait, let me be clear about what Celeste actually planned, because the reality was somehow worse than even this perverted logic suggests. Celeste did not have daughters, but starting in 1852, she began acquiring them. The first was a girl named Marie Louise, aged 13, whom Celeste purchased from a bankrupt planter in Natchitoches. But Celeste did not register Marie Louise as a slave. Instead, she forged documents identifying the girl as her late husband's daughter from a previous relationship. She had Marie Louise baptized with the Bellerose surname, establishing legal proof of free status. The second was Isabel, age 12, purchased from a Natchez dealer in 1853. Again, Celeste forged documents, this time claiming Isabel was a distant cousin whose parents had died of yellow fever. The third was Genevieve, aged 14, acquired in 1854. Celeste told neighbors the girl was the daughter of a deceased friend from New Orleans who had asked Celeste to raise her. By 1855, Celeste had 4 teenage girls living in Bellerose Manor, all legally documented as free, all legally part of the Bellerose family, and all completely under Celeste's control. The local community accepted these additions without much question. In Creole society, taking in orphaned relatives was common, and Celeste was known as a pious woman who would naturally extend Christian charity. What no one knew was that Celeste had purchased these girls specifically for her breeding program. She had selected them based on physical characteristics, health, and temperament. She had paid less for them than she would have paid for adult field hands. And now that they were legally free and legally part of her family, she could implement the next phase of her plan. Lucien Bellerose turned 20 years old. He was a handsome young man, educated, and like most sons of plantation families, expected to eventually marry a suitable Creole girl from a respectable family. What his mother had planned for him was quite different. Celeste began by gradually conditioning Lucien to see the girls in the household differently. She started assigning Marie Louise, now 17, to bring Lucien his meals. She arranged for the two to spend time alone together, working on estate accounts or other tasks that required privacy. She spoke to Lucien about the importance of family legacy, about the need to ensure Bellerose prosperity through any means necessary. The actual conversation, where Celeste proposed her plan to Lucien, occurred on a humid evening in November 1850. They were alone in Celeste's study, the windows shuttered against the possibility of eavesdroppers, according to a letter Lucien later wrote and hid in the plantation library. Celeste explained her vision with the cold logic of a business proposal. She told him that Marie Louise would bear his child, that the child would be registered as the offspring of one of the enslaved women on the plantation, making it legally Celeste's property, that the child could be sold for $400 to $600, providing much-needed income for the estate, and that this process could be repeated with each of the girls, creating a sustainable source of revenue that would save Bellerose from bankruptcy. Lucien's reaction, according to his letter, was initially one of horror and refusal. He understood what his mother was proposing was not just morally wrong, but also legally questionable. If discovered, it could destroy the Bellerose name completely, but Celeste was prepared for his resistance. She spent the next month breaking down his objections one by one. She reminded him that they were facing bankruptcy and the loss of everything their family had built. She argued that Marie Louise and the other girls were technically property anyway, purchased with Bellerose money and living on Bellerose charity. She painted a picture of a future where they were prosperous again, where the family name was restored to its former glory. And perhaps most insidiously, she began bringing Marie Louise more frequently into Lucien's presence, creating a familiarity and eventually an attraction that made what Celeste proposed seem less unthinkable. In January 1857, Marie Louise became pregnant. She was 18 years old, Lucien was 21, and Celeste watched the development of this pregnancy with the attention of someone conducting a scientific experiment. During Marie Louise's pregnancy, Celeste implemented strict security measures. She restricted the girls' movements, claiming concern for their health and reputation. She personally supervised all their activities. And most importantly, she began coaching them in the story they would tell if anyone asked questions. The first child was born in September 1857. A boy, he was healthy, with Lucien's dark hair and Marie Louise's delicate features. Celeste immediately took the infant from Marie Louise and brought him to the slave quarters, where he was given to an enslaved woman named Claudine, who had recently lost her own child. The falsified birth certificate, obtained from a corrupt clerk in Opelousas, listed Claudine as the mother. The child was registered as Celeste's property. 3 weeks later, Celeste sold the baby to a planter in Assumption Parish for $450. Marie Louise was given no time to recover emotionally. Within 2 months, Celeste had her pregnant again. The systematic breeding program had begun in earnest. By 1858, Celeste had expanded the program to include her second son, Remy, now 20 years old. Remy required less persuasion than Lucien. He had grown up watching his mother's transformation of Bellerose, had absorbed her philosophy of practical necessity over sentiment, and saw the girls as tools for family advancement rather than as human beings worthy of consideration. Isabel, now 17, was assigned to Remy. Her first pregnancy began in the spring of 1858. Claude, the youngest son, was only 18 in 1858, but Celeste was already preparing him for his role. She began including him in discussions about plantation management, showing him the account books where she recorded income from child sales. She spoke to him about duty and sacrifice and the burdens of maintaining a family legacy. By 1859, all three Bellerose sons were participating in their mother's breeding program. Marie-Louise was pregnant for the third time. Isabel was pregnant for the second time. Genevieve, now 19, had been assigned to Claude and was pregnant for the first time. And Celeste had acquired a fourth girl, Marguerite, aged 15, purchased from a bankrupt estate in Lafayette. The births occurred at regular intervals, carefully timed to avoid suspicion. Celeste delivered most of the babies herself, with assistance from an elderly enslaved midwife named Cecile, who had been sworn to secrecy under threat of being sold to a brutal sugar plantation downriver. Each baby was immediately separated from its mother. Each was registered as the child of an enslaved woman, and each was sold within weeks, usually to distant buyers who would never connect the child to Bellerose estate. The girls themselves existed in a state of psychological torture that is difficult to fully comprehend. They were legally free, but functionally enslaved. They were part of the Bellerose family, but treated as breeding stock. They bore children they were never allowed to keep, children whose fates they would never know. Marie-Louise attempted escape in the summer of 1860. She made it approximately 8 miles from the plantation before being caught by a professional slave catcher whom Celeste had hired specifically for this possibility. When she was returned to Bellerose, Celeste confined her to a locked room in the manor for 3 months. The only reason Marie-Louise was not sold south was that she was 4 months pregnant at the time, and Celeste needed that child born at Bellerose to maintain control over the documentation. The other girls learned from Marie-Louise's failed attempt. They realized that escape was nearly impossible and that resistance would only make their situations worse. They fell into a state of resigned obedience, performing their designated roles with the mechanical efficiency of people whose spirits had been systematically broken. By 1861, Celeste had perfected her system. She kept detailed records in a coded journal, tracking pregnancies, births, and sales with the precision of a commercial breeding operation. She had established relationships with several slave traders who asked no questions about the provenance of the babies she sold, and she had expanded her operation to include not just the girls she called her wards, but also several of her enslaved women, creating a comprehensive breeding program that generated substantial income. The money from child sales allowed Celeste to not only pay off her inherited debts but to begin expanding Bellerose operations. She purchased additional land and more enslaved workers. She renovated the manor house and acquired luxuries she hadn't been able to afford in years. To outsiders, Bellerose estate appeared to be thriving under the widow's capable management. But the Civil War changed everything. When Louisiana seceded from the Union in January 1861, the structure of Southern society began to crack. As the war progressed and Union forces advanced into Confederate territory, plantations across Louisiana faced increasing uncertainty. Celeste initially believed the Confederacy would win quickly and that her operation would continue uninterrupted. But by 1863, Union victories at Vicksburg and Port Hudson made it clear that Louisiana would become a major theater of war. Federal forces were advancing, and with them came the possibility of investigation, exposure, and destruction of everything Celeste had built. It was this fear that led Celeste to make a decision that would transform her secret into something even more horrifying. If Union soldiers were coming, if investigation was inevitable, she needed to hide the evidence of her breeding program. But how do you hide children who bear obvious family resemblance? How do you conceal years of systematic abuse? Celeste's solution was to literally lock them away. Starting in early 1863, Celeste began moving children to the cellar. Not the babies who had been sold, but the older children, the ones who were now 4, 5, 6 years old. The ones whose mixed heritage was becoming increasingly obvious. The ones who could potentially identify their biological parents if questioned by authorities. She claimed she was protecting them from the violence of war, but the reality was far darker. She was hiding evidence. She was locking her own biological grandchildren in underground rooms with minimal light, limited food, and no contact with the outside world. The cellar at Bellerose was extensive, a legacy of the plantation's original construction in the 1790s. It had been designed to store wine and supplies, with thick stone walls and multiple chambers. Celeste converted these chambers into cells. She installed heavy iron doors with locks. She created small openings for food and waste but no windows. And she moved the children there one by one, telling the girls that their offspring were being sent to safe houses in New Orleans. By March 1864, 19 children were living in the Bellerose cellar. The eldest was 8 years old. The youngest was barely 3. They lived in near darkness, sleeping on straw pallets, eating whatever scraps Celeste or her sons brought them. They were not physically tortured, but the psychological cruelty of their confinement was immense. They had been born into captivity and now existed in an underground prison, knowing nothing of the world above them except what filtered through the iron doors. The children developed strange behaviors from their confinement. They became sensitive to light, crying when exposed to even dim lamplight. They spoke in whispers, having learned that loud voices brought punishment. Some of them developed repetitive movements, rocking back and forth, or scratching patterns into the stone walls. The psychological damage was profound and irreversible. Meanwhile, above ground, Celeste maintained appearances. She attended church services and Opelousas. She entertained neighbors with carefully orchestrated dinners. She spoke passionately about supporting the Confederate cause. No one suspected that beneath the elegant manor house, nearly 24 children were slowly being destroyed by isolation and neglect. The girls who had borne these children were kept in strict confinement as well. They were no longer needed for breeding. The war had disrupted the slave trade, making it impossible to sell babies without attracting unwanted attention. So they existed in a kind of limbo, living in the manor but treated as prisoners, constantly watched to ensure they didn't speak of what had happened. Marie-Louise, now 25 years old, had borne 7 children for the Bellerose family. None of them were with her. 3 had been sold before the war. 4 were in the cellar. She had been pregnant for nearly a third of her adult life. Her body bore the scars of multiple difficult labors. Her mind had retreated to a place where she could barely communicate coherently. It was Marie-Louise who ultimately doomed Celeste's operation. In February 1864, as Union forces began occupying parts of St. Landry Parish, Marie-Louise made one final attempt at resistance. She set fire to the western wing of the manor house during the night, hoping the chaos would allow her to reach the cellar and free the children. The fire was contained before it could spread to the main structure, but it attracted attention from Union patrols operating in the area. Captain James Morrison, of the 28th Massachusetts Infantry, led a squad to investigate reports of the fire, arriving at Bellerose on the morning of March 12, 1864. What Morrison found initially seemed unremarkable: a plantation house with minor fire damage, a nervous widow and her 3 sons, a handful of enslaved people, and several young women whom Celeste claimed were her wards. But Morrison was an experienced officer who had investigated several plantations for evidence of Confederate activity. He knew when people were hiding something. It was one of his sergeants, a man named Patrick Donovan, who noticed the iron door set into the floor of the cellar during a routine search of the property. The door was locked with a heavy padlock and bolted from the outside. When Donovan asked what was stored behind it, Celeste claimed it was the plantation wine cellar, nothing of interest. But Morrison insisted on seeing inside. When Celeste claimed she had misplaced the key, Morrison had his men break the lock with a crowbar. The scene that greeted them was one that Morrison would describe in his official report as the most disturbing thing I have witnessed in 3 years of war, including the battlefield at Antietam. 19 children, filthy, malnourished, and terrified, huddled together in the darkness. When the soldiers opened the door and light flooded in, the children screamed and tried to hide, having become so sensitive to light that even dim daylight caused them pain. It took Morrison and his men over an hour to coax the children out of the cellar. They emerged slowly, blinking in the light, unable to walk properly due to months or years of confinement. Several of the older children carried the younger ones, having developed a protective family structure in their underground prison. What shocked Morrison most was the obvious family resemblance among the children and the Belarus sons. All of them had those distinctive pale green eyes. All had variations of auburn hair. Several had facial features that unmistakably marked them as Belarus descendants. When Morrison confronted Celeste, she initially claimed the children were the offspring of enslaved women temporarily stored in the cellar for their protection during the chaos of war. But her story collapsed under even minimal questioning. The children were too light-skinned, their features were too European, and most damningly, several of the older children could speak, and what they said made it clear they had been imprisoned deliberately, not protected. Over the following days, as Morrison conducted interviews with everyone on the plantation, the full scope of Celeste's operation emerged. Marie-Louise, broken but finally free to speak, told everything. Isabel confirmed the story. The enslaved people who had witnessed parts of the scheme provided corroborating details. Even Lucian, perhaps hoping for mercy, wrote a full confession that he sealed and gave to Morrison. The details that emerged were staggering in their systematic cruelty. Over 13 years, Celeste had orchestrated at least 28 births as part of her breeding program. Of these, 12 babies had been sold before the war made such sales impossible. 16 children had been born during the war years and were now imprisoned in the cellar, or had died from the harsh conditions. 3 children had died in confinement, their small bodies buried in unmarked graves behind the manor house. Morrison faced an unprecedented situation. He was dealing with crimes that fell into a gray area of existing law. The girls had been legally free, making their forced breeding potentially a form of kidnapping and assault. But they had also been purchased as slaves and then fraudulently declared free, complicating their legal status. The children were technically enslaved according to their falsified birth certificates, but biologically they were free due to their mother's status. Morrison sent urgent reports to his superior officers requesting guidance. While he waited for instructions, he had Celeste and her 3 sons placed under house arrest. He moved the children from the cellar to clean rooms in the manor, where they received medical attention from the unit's surgeon, and he attempted to establish identities and legal status for all the victims. The response from Morrison's superiors was swift and unequivocal. The case was to be classified as confidential. Details were not to be shared with civilian authorities or the press. The Army would handle the matter internally and quietly. The reasoning behind this decision was political. In 1864, the Union was struggling to maintain support for the war, particularly regarding policies about freed slaves. The revelation that a plantation owner had been running a breeding operation using legally free women and her own sons as breeders would create a scandal that could be weaponized by Confederate sympathizers. It could be used to argue that Southern white women were being victimized by the chaos of war and emancipation. It was easier, simpler, to bury the whole thing. Celeste Belarus and her 3 sons were arrested and charged with crimes under military law, but the specifics of the charges were kept vague. They were convicted in a closed military tribunal in May 1864 and sentenced to imprisonment. Celeste was sent to a military prison in New York, where she died in 1867 at age 48. Lucien, Remy, and Claude were imprisoned at Fort Jefferson in the Dry Tortugas, where all three died of yellow fever in 1868. The children were placed with freed slave families in occupied areas of Louisiana. Their legal status was quietly changed to free, and they were given new names to help them start over. The girls who had been forced to bear these children were also declared free and provided with small financial compensation and travel documents to leave Louisiana. Marie Louise moved to Massachusetts, where she lived with a Quaker family until her death in 1881. She never married and never spoke publicly about what had happened at Bellerose. Isabel moved to Canada and similarly lived in silence until her death in 1889. Bellerose estate was confiscated by the Union Army and sold at auction in 1864. The manor house was demolished in 1870, and the land was divided among freed slaves as part of Reconstruction efforts. The official military reports on the case remained classified until 1946, when a military historian researching Civil War-era documents discovered Morrison's original reports in an archive. Even then, the details were not widely publicized. The first scholarly article about the Bellerose case was not published until 1978, and it appeared in an obscure journal of Louisiana history that few people read. Today, there is no marker at the site of the former Bellerose estate. The land is privately owned farmland, and most people in St. Landry Parish have no knowledge of what occurred there. The few historians who have written about the case debate whether Celeste was mentally ill, purely evil, or a product of a system that had so thoroughly dehumanized enslaved people that she applied the same logic to her own family. What is indisputable is that Celeste Bellerose created one of the most systematic and coldly calculated abuse schemes in American history. Gestri in desto, she didn't act out of passion or sudden cruelty, but out of economic calculation and a complete absence of empathy. She transformed human reproduction into a business model and sacrificed both her victims, all, and her own grandchildren to maintain her plantation. The children who survived their imprisonment in the Bellerose cellar carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Several never learned to read or write. Most had difficulty forming normal social connections. Some developed severe anxiety disorders that made it nearly impossible for them to function in ordinary society. They were the forgotten victims of a system that commodified human life so thoroughly that even family bonds could be monetized. Perhaps the most tragic aspect is that Celeste's actions were not as unusual as we would like to believe. While the specific details of her scheme were extreme, the underlying logic forcing enslaved women to bear children to increase plantation wealth was standard practice throughout the South. What made Celeste monstrous was not that she invented something new, but that she applied existing practices to her own family with ruthless efficiency. The story of Bellerose estate reminds us that the worst horrors are often perpetrated not by obviously deranged individuals, but by people who convince themselves they are being practical, who rationalize their cruelty as necessity, who transform human beings into spreadsheet entries and see nothing wrong with the calculation. What do you think? Could a story like this happen again in different forms? Are there systems today that dehumanize people in ways we don't recognize because we are too close to see them clearly? Leave your thoughts in the comments. If this story disturbed you as much as it disturbed me, share it with someone who needs to understand that human capacity for cruelty has no limits when people convince themselves that practical necessity outweighs moral obligation. Subscribe for more stories that force us to confront uncomfortable truths about our history. See you in the next video.